Do they see us at home?
Order. Order. Cabinet Secretary, can you hear me? Calling Cabinet Secretary Ewing.
Yes, I can.
Can you hear me clearly?
Very clearly.
That's good, because we're all hearing you perfectly. And I believe that we've got great faith in our technology in order to conduct this session efficiently. Are we set to go, yeah?
We are indeed.
There sounds like there's a little there might just be a little delay on this side. I don't know if there's one coming back. Yes,
I don't think so. I think it's more or less as if we're in the same room, right, except you're even larger than life.
Well, thank you. Well, we try our best. There is a slight delay from us to you, but I'm sure we'll be able to accommodate that, and will be no problem. Okay. So we'll start, Fergus, if you're okay. Order, order. Cabinet Secretary, we're very, very grateful to you for joining us from this splendid video link from the Scottish Parliament this afternoon. This is our first session into Agriculture in Scotland inquiry, and we're grateful for you to join us. For our record, who you are, who you represent, which I think we know, and anything by way of a short introductory statement. Cabinet Secretary.
Well, thank you very much, Convener, and I'm joined by my senior officials, David Barnes and George Burgess, and I'm extremely grateful for the invitation to participate by video conference to your evidence today, and I have brief opening comments, if I may. Scotland did not vote for Brexit. We voted against Brexit, and our analysis shows that if Brexit must happen, then continued membership of the single market and customs union is by far the best solution for our economy, society and people. Therefore, all my comments today should be taken in that light. I'd like to highlight briefly three things. First, it's important for people to understand that the powers in this UK Agriculture Bill are not needed for March 2019, even in a no-deal scenario. The powers that would be needed in that scenario are being created through a different vehicle. So the powers of this bill are not urgent. Second, as drafted, the Agricultural Bill does not respect devolution, and so, of course, the Scottish Government and Scottish Parliament cannot accept it. This is a very serious point on which the Scottish Government's position is explained in detail in our memorandum to the Scottish Parliament, which I understand has been made available to your clerks. Thirdly, there are serious omissions in this bill. It fails to deliver on a number of promises that were made about Brexit for the rural sector. We'd like amendments to the bill to address issues such as the red meat levy, guarantees over future rural funding, the protection of import standards and geographical indications. Convener, we've sought to be cooperative throughout this process, and myself in particular. But it's fair to say we have found the process leading up to this bill very difficult. Time and again, we received little or no information from DEFRA, despite repeated requests, only to be presented eventually with virtually a fait accompli. This is not what we would expect or hope for. Nonetheless, we will continue to try to work constructively with the UK Government on the bill and all other Brexit issues. I'm very happy to answer your questions.
I'm grateful, and thank you for that, Cabinet Secretary. I was going to ask you your reasons for not accepting an inclusion in the bill in the way that Wales and Northern Ireland have, but I think you've clearly explained that in your opening remarks. And can you just therefore clarify, will the Scottish Government implement a new post-Brexit agricultural support in Scotland without a schedule in this bill? And is it your intention to bring forward Scottish Government proposals for a means to deal with the situation post-Brexit?
Well, I stress that I have sought to and continue to seek to work constructively with the UK Government. The sticking point is that it's very clear to me, that there are at least three areas in which the bill as drafted would predate, would remove, would grab powers from the Scottish Parliament. We may come on to that, and I'm very happy to go over these in great detail. The frustrating thing for me is that although we have set out our stall, although we have set out our reasoning, our justification for the position we have put, We have not received from the UK government their reasoning for the position that they adopt, namely that these matters are reserved issues. We don't need to take powers through this bill. We will be able to continue to make payments. That is not an issue. And indeed, I'm afraid to say, Convener, there already has been a shocking amount of scaremongering by several other Scottish MPs suggesting that if we do not take powers in this bill, and if we do not have a Scottish schedule, that somehow we will be unable to make payments to our farmers and our crofters. That is simply not the case. So, firstly, we will seek to cooperate, but secondly, we will take all measures and exercise all powers that are necessary for us in due course. But this bill is not necessary for us to be able to do that.
I think that was abundantly clear to this committee. Could I just ask this the last of my opening questions? Are there any conditions at all possible that you would agree to accept being included in a schedule in this bill?
Well, I mean, if the points of concern can be adequately dealt with, and it's not too late, they can be dealt with if there is goodwill, then of course we can consider cooperation. I have met on numerous occasions with Michael Gove and George Eustice. I've sought to develop a good working relationship with them. My officials, senior officials, likewise have worked for months and months with their counterparts. Even although we wholly disagree with UK government's view on Brexit, we've taken the view that it's our duty, ex officio, to do everything we can to cooperate for the greater good of Scotland's farmers and crofters and the rural community at large. So we're ruling nothing out at the moment, and if indeed Mr Gove is willing to deal with the points that we have raised repeatedly, directly, eyeball to eyeball, then I'm very happy to consider that with a view to being as cooperative as we can. But we will not tolerate removal of powers from the Scottish Parliament. And indeed, maybe we might come on to some of the consequences, if we were to do that, what the consequences might be, which I think would plainly be to Scotland's detriment and to the detriment of farmers and crofters in Scotland.
And we will indeed come on to some of these issues, but we'll move on just now. And next up is Kirstene Hair.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, NFUS Scotland said it's concerned that without a schedule in the agricultural bill, it is possible that the Scottish Government may not have any legal vehicle of delivering payments beyond the 29th of March 2019. Are they wrong?
That's what they said initially, but they've since changed that. It is not simply not correct. In fact, there is no requirement in this bill at all which would prevent us from continuing to make payments in 2019. That's simply rubbish.
So do you think it's responsible to reject the schedule in the bill, not bring forward your own bill, and leave Scottish farmers in a situation where we're 5 months away from exit day, and although you're suggesting there is a way, there's no clarity given on how the Scottish Government is going to provide support payments after that? And it just seems, following on from the disaster around the CAP payments in recent years, that the Scottish Government just have a complete disregard for the rural community. Do you, hand on heart, believe that this is governing responsibly?
Well, Convener, there's about 7 or 8 different questions all in a kind of mélange there. But firstly, let me stress that the central premise of Ms Hare's questioning is untrue. There is no requirement for this bill to enable us to continue to make payments. The member has suggested that we are tardy in making payments to our farmers and crofters. The truth, in fact, is that Scotland's farmers and crofters, 99% of those eligible to receive payments, receive 90% of their payments from the 5th of October, some time before farmers in England will receive a penny piece. So the facts are that this year, thanks to the excellent work that our officials have been doing, 99% of our eligible farmers and crofters will receive up to 90% of their entitlements in respect of the Pillar 1 payments And I think that's a very welcome measure, and I know that's the case because I speak to farmers and crofters a great deal.
Just to clarify, we did have NFUS just in before you, Cabinet Secretary, and I'm not particularly sure that the comments attributed to NFUS by Kirstene here was actually accurate. And there is a quote here that they gave to the Agricultural Bill Committee the other day where they say there is no doubt that the Scottish Government will be able to continue making payments, but they would be governed by the existing rules of the CAP. And that was their concern, was that there was no move on from the existing rules of the CAP other than the fact that payments couldn't be made. Do you recognise that as the position of the NFUS, just to clarify?
I'm grateful, Convener, that you've clarified. That is exactly my understanding. I read through the Hansard of the evidence. That is precisely what the NFU representative, Mr. Hall, said. He did not say what Mr. Hare attributed to him. I'm grateful for that clarification. Taking on Mr. Hall's point directly, there is nothing that would prevent us from establishing the necessary powers by legislation, if that were necessary, if that became necessary, in order for us, in due course, to make departures and changes from the CAP. That, I'm afraid, too, is a red herring which certain other members are putting around. So let me be quite clear. This bill is not necessary to address the point that Mr. Hall fairly made. We can deal with it if necessary in Scotland. But until we know exactly what the situation is going to be, we cannot formulate the direct plan. And if it is the case that Mr. Gove, as I mentioned a moment ago, Convener, in response to your question, agrees to resolve the differences between us, then perhaps that won't be necessary. So we will make a plan once we know the facts, and we will work hard constructively with all our partners across the UK to seek what agreement we can, whilst standing up resolutely for Scotland's interests.
We've got a couple of other... We'll come to you in a minute, David. I know John Lamont was very keen to come in. John.
Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon, Mr Ewing. Mr Ewing, you spoke very confidently there about the Scottish Government's ability to continue financial support. Could you set out for the benefit of the committee the legislative provisions that actually allow the Scottish Government to continue to support by opting out of the Agricultural Bill, please?
The existing powers under devolution allow us to carry on making payments. The UK Agricultural Bill doesn't detract from those powers. As you know, Mr Lamont, agriculture is a devolved issue. And the problem with one of the problems with the UK bill, which has been pointed out by the House of Lords, is that it contains not one scooby of a hint of what the substantive policy in the UK is. Fortunately, or unfortunately, we know that the only thing we know actually for certainty about the UK policy is they want to stop direct payments to farmers around 227. Now, I don't know about Mr Lamont, Convener. I don't want my constituents to lose direct payments. Does Mr Lamont want his constituents to lose theirs?
You've not actually answered my question. Could you, for the benefit of the committee, set out the legislative provisions which allow the Scottish Government to continue financial support?
Well, the legislative provision will exist under the Withdrawal Act and the Continuity Bill, which will allow for us to keep payments from 2019.
Continuity Bill?
That's the continuity.
The Continuity Bill?
The Withdrawal Act and Continuity Bill will allow us to keep payments from 2019. That is the precise legal foundation. And of course, that will allow us to continue what I assume the Scottish Tories wish us to do, which is to exercise our powers in Scotland to make policies.
Bill hasn't yet been enacted.
For Scottish farmers, such as the support for hill farmers, which is absolutely essential.
Cabinet Secretary, the Continuity Bill hasn't been enacted yet, so how... It may not be... Are you obviously working on the basis the Supreme Court is going to give a judgment in your favour, or what?
Well, I hope Brexit won't go ahead at all. And that's an option, isn't it?
You seem unable or unwilling to answer any of my questions. So the Continuity Bill has not yet been enacted. It's currently before the Supreme Court. So could you set out the legislative provisions as currently stand to allow financial support for farmers to continue after Brexit?
Either of the provisions that I've mentioned will allow us to do that, and either of them will be necessary, otherwise Brexit won't happen.
The bill's not been enacted, so what currently exists, if the bill's not enacted, what legislative provisions allow the Scottish Government to provide financial support to Scottish farmers?
Well, I've already answered that question, Convener, very, very clearly.
I think we'll move on from that. Mr. Duguid, David Duguid.
Yeah, I'm trying to be very clear here, Cabinet Secretary. I just want to ask, when we leave the EU, when we leave the CAP, if there is no schedule in the Agricultural Bill for Scotland, similar, if not exactly the same as what is provided for Wales, and if your continuity bill doesn't get enacted, what will be the mechanism for Scottish farmers to continue to be paid?
This bill is not necessary to allow us to continue payments. It's very disappointing that this canard is continuing to be perpetrated by the Scottish Tories, because I'm afraid it is complete and utter scaremongering. It is not necessary for us to have a schedule in the bill for that to happen, although we continue to seek to work cooperatively with the UK government. Our plan, contained in the document called Stability and Simplicity, envisages that we have a period of 5 years, broadly speaking the first 2 years of which would provide with continuance of the current schemes and payments, and the second period of 3 years would allow us to try out different measures whilst continuing to provide the benefit of certainty to farmers. Our document, Convener, is the only plan in the UK. The UK's proposals were set out in what could loosely be described as a discussion document called Health and Harmony. And the only one thing that is clear in that document is that DEFRA and perhaps the Treasury are intent on stopping direct payments to Mr. Duckert's constituency just as quickly as they can get away with it. We believe that is completely the wrong route, and that the farmer's role for food production, as well as stewardship of the countryside, must be continued with the necessary support for the public goods that are provided thereby.
Kirstene Jardine.
Thank you very much. Cabinet Secretary, I wonder if I could ask you, we seem to be speaking a lot about hypotheticals, and if the continuity bill is passed, if we leave the European Union, if this happens, if that happens. Surely the situation is that there is a bill on the table which would give you powers similar to Wales. Do you not think, or do you think it's not incumbent on the Scottish Parliament to recognise that those powers are there and to work within the possible and do what is necessary at the moment, rather than cause delay and further confusion by talking all the time about hypotheticals?
No one is causing confusion except certain MPs who choose to misinterpret the very plain realities of the law, which are that this bill, I repeat, is not necessary. Mr. Hall has recognised that, the NFUS has recognised that. The only people who seem to me, Convener, not to recognise that are certain members of Parliament. Could I also say that this bill would, in Part 6 and 7, remove powers from Scotland over producers' organisations, fair dealing in the supply chain, and the implementation of the WTO agreement on agriculture. Of these three, and they're all important, Ms. Jardine is asking us in the Scottish Parliament to accept a situation where we lose powers over these three things. And in respect of the WTO, well, that's the premise of your question. The WTO
it's not the premise
implementation would result in very serious potential detriment for Scottish farmers and crofters. I can't accept that. I'm surprised the Lib Dems would.
Actually, the premise of my question, Cabinet Secretary, was that you're basing your argument on a hypothetical agreement by the Supreme Court. What are you going to do if the Supreme Court says no? That was the basis of my question.
George Eustice agreed that this bill is not necessary. Ironically, although we would expect Scottish MPs to stand up for the interest of the Scottish Parliament in continuing to be able to exercise it of all powers, it seems that Mr. Eustice is taking a more enlightened view, Convener, than some of your colleagues today.
Tommy Sheppard.
Good afternoon, Cabinet Secretary. To change the subject slightly, another thing which the UK government and DEFRA have signalled is that they wish to shift the payments regime away from one linked to land and for the payment of common goods, as it's described. Can you tell us your thoughts as to the applicability of such a system for Scotland, and if you don't wish to implement it as DEFRA would wish, do you have adequate powers at the moment to tailor a separate scheme for Scotland?
Yes, I can answer that, of course. In Scotland, we believe that it's important to recognise the contribution that farmers and crofters make in looking after the countryside and their stewardship, environmental work, and I personally believe they very often don't get sufficient credit for the good practices and the improved environmental practices that they're conducting. But also, that we also recognise they're producing high quality food. They are food producers. And I think when the public think of farmers, they still think of farmers as people whose job it is to produce high quality food. In Scotland, livestock farming is absolutely essential. And under devolution, we have been able to tailor our own policy support towards livestock farming in a way that allows our hill farmers, our beef and sheep farming to operate. I'm seriously worried that the Health and Harmony paper appears to offer little comfort or support and barely mentions the necessity for high quality food, particularly when we hear from the UK's own advisors that supermarket shelves may be empty within days of a no-deal Brexit, and that there could be serious problems about continuity of food supplies. This is not the time to risk the continued supply of food for the country, and it's extraordinary that the UK government does not recognise the importance of farmers as food producers. The second part of Mr Sheppard's question was, will we be able to tailor our policies in order to improve the CAP, which obviously needs many areas of improvement? The answer is yes, we can. Yes, we will. But in addition to that, in our paper, our plan, Stability and Simplicity, we have already set out in quite considerable detail our proposals about how we would do that and how we would seek to do that. And although we haven't finalised our consideration of the responses to the consultation paper, and we had a great number, I'm able to share with this committee that there's very strong support for the central thrust of our paper, that farmers and crofters need a period of stability and certainty, particularly since the rest of the preparations of Brexit by the UK government do appear to be, to use a Gaelic word, a búrach.
Thank you for that. Just to clarify then, are you saying that you have sufficient legislative ability at the moment in the Scottish Parliament to be able to design a payment scheme in the future that meets Scottish circumstances, and that it doesn't require any further legislation either through the Scottish Parliament or through the Westminster Parliament?
Well, we may require to introduce legislation in the Scottish Parliament. We haven't come to the point where it's necessary to determine if that's the case, because, as I said at the beginning to the convener, we want to cooperate with the UK government if they will cooperate with us in providing justification for their position, something that they have thus far not done. But if it's necessary for us to legislate in the absence of agreement with the UK government, then of course the Scottish government would consider that, and it will be up to the Scottish Parliament to consider such legislation. There is plenty of time for that to happen, and there is no risk whatsoever to our being able to do what Mr Sheppard has raised.
Thank you.
Right, thank you. Ross Thompson.
Thank you very much, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, this afternoon we've heard evidence from the NFU, who raised their own concerns about divergence, which could result in differences within the UK internal market. So would you accept that there is a risk that with too much divergence that could impact on the UK's internal market? And if so, how do you think that risk should be managed?
Well, there already is considerable divergence. I mean, for example, I hope the member will know that we have less favoured area schemes in Scotland. My understanding is that that was abandoned about 7 years ago down south. I've just picked one example, but surely devolution means we must be free to do what is necessary in Scotland's needs. That's the nature of devolution, is that there should not need to be a uniform approach, and that we in Scotland decide what to do. And there has been, I think, a fair degree of consensus across political parties that, for example, divergence in support for our hill farmers is absolutely necessary. What is disappointing is that nothing the UK government has said deals with the unfairness of divergence in funding, particularly the convergence monies, which the UK government in 2013-14 decided, instead of distributing to the Scottish farmers and crofters for whom it was entitled, decided instead to distribute that across the rest of the UK. So that divergence has plainly had a high cost, which the member may know is around £14,000 lost revenue over the period for every farmer and crofter in Scotland on average.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. You're absolutely right that devolution means taking different decisions to meet different needs. But it isn't a justification for breaking up the UK internal market. And we've heard again today, it's crystal clear in evidence that the NFU and those in the farming community would not want to see barriers to the market in which they sell most to. And in your opening statement, I think you said yourself about the importance of alignment with the EU single market. But I'm sure you would recognise that the UK internal market accounts for a considerably larger proportion of Scottish exports, 61% as opposed to 16% with the EU 27. Is it not then of paramount importance that nothing is done that might break up that very important UK internal market?
Well, nobody is suggesting to use the terminology that the member has just employed, breaking up the UK internal market. It is the case that many of our successful farmers are operating on a UK basis, supplying large companies, supermarkets and wholesalers throughout the UK. There's absolutely nothing whatsoever in our plans that would alter that. So I have no idea what the member means when he accuses us of taking measures to break up the market. What I can say is that if he thinks that we should give up our devolved powers over agriculture and forfeit the right to tailor our policies in the way that we have, if he thinks that we should terminate support for our hill farmers, if he thinks that we should end direct support payments, as the Treasury and Mr Gove seem to think, well, I respectfully disagree.
Well, thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. I'm sure when you watch this back, you'll see I didn't accuse you of anything. You may have skipped breakfast this morning, given your mood, but I'm sure you'll have seen that I did not accuse you of anything. But I'm glad that you've given us the reassurance that your government will not do anything to break up the UK internal market. And my last question would be just to pick up on a point that was raised by Christine Jardine, which I don't think was actually answered by you. We have had evidence again today from the NFU who have said that farmers are begging for certainty from your government. You have pinned their hopes on your continuity bill. If the Supreme Court says that it is illegal, what will you do?
Well, I don't accept the premise, and I don't recognise, incidentally, this emotive quote that...
Quote, by the way, quoted directly in evidence this morning.
Again, I will need an answer. I'm happy again to provide absolute assurance to every farmer and crofter in Scotland that there is nothing in this bill that prevents us from continuing to make the payments. We are making the payments. They've gone out the door earlier than down south, something I would have thought the member might have been pleased about, with 99% of eligible farmers receiving 90% or up to 90% of their direct payments in the month of October. I think that's a pragmatic and welcome measure, and we will continue with it. If I may say, just to finish with this point, Convener, the big uncertainty is this, and the NFU did raise this, actually. that funding, quantum of funding, post-Brexit is the big uncertainty. And I must recall that in the run-up to the Brexit referendum, the Brexiteers, including Mr Gove and Mr Eustice, assured voters, who no doubt accepted those assurances in the ballot box, that EU funding for rural Britain would be at least matched. Now, I've asked Mr Gove to confirm on the record, in Parliament, in Hansard, that this pledge will be obtemperate. But the various limited assurances that we have go nowhere to provide that assurance. That's the real uncertainty, and the NFU, from my reading of their evidence and their comments over the last week, have indicated that the lack of overall funding certainty is the big problem, coupled with the fact that we know that the Treasury wants to cease direct support payments to your constituents. Well, I don't agree with that. I think they deserve the payments. I think, incidentally, that they provide the public good already, and they should be recognised for that by our willingness across all parties to recognise that they earn the support that they receive, both for food production and environmental stewardship.
Kirstene Hair.
Thank you, Chair. Cabinet Secretary, do you not think it may alleviate some of the uncertainty which was raised by Scottish Environment Link, the National Council of Rural Advisors, National Farmers Union of Scotland and Scottish Crofting Federation in the previous session, if you were able to put a date on when the Scottish Parliament would propose an agricultural bill?
No, I don't, because I don't actually think that this uncertainty exists except in the minds of certain MPs. I've provided absolute assurance that these payments will continue, and I can also say that our paper, Stability and Simplicity, has had an extremely positive response, precisely for the reasons that the member indicates. Namely, that what farmers and crofters want is a period of certainty contrasting with the current Brexit chaos. Certainty that they will continue to receive the payments that, after all, they have come to expect from the EU over a 7-year period. And Mr Hall made this point specifically, since you're quoting stakeholders. Mr Hall said that because the EU has determined support over programme periods of 7 years, and is due to once again from 220 to 227, that it is precisely because there is a lack of long-term funding commitment from the UK government post-Brexit that is causing the uncertainty. And that's precisely why Stability and Simplicity, our plan, seeks to provide that certainty amidst the Brexit chaos.
Cabinet Secretary, did you listen to the previous panel?
I've read the Hansard of the evidence that Mr Hall gave, and I've also had memoranda indicating the evidence that were given. And I'm virtually quoting verbatim from what Mr Hall said about the lack of funding certainty over the fact that in the EU their programmes are devised over a period of 7 years, whereas, what assurance is it that Mr Gove has provided? Well, direct farm support till 222, Pillar 2 payments, excluding farm support until 220. Well, that includes things like forestry grants. Forestry is a long-term business, is it not, Ms Hare? And therefore, surely we must have assurances that go beyond just 18 months' time.
Cabinet Secretary, I would really appreciate it if you could answer the question, because it seems to me that you're seeming to waste time in this session, and if we could just get the questions answered, then we would get more evidence from the session. The panel that I was talking about, which perhaps there's confusion over the Agricultural Bill Committee Hansard publication, and I was actually talking about the panel that we had in just prior to when you came on the video link. That's what I asked, yes or no, did you listen to that panel session?
Well, I haven't been able to listen to that panel session, and I will do so later, but I'm making quotes from what Mr Hall said, which I'm afraid goes diametrically opposed
one final question.
Of your question,
Can we just
that somehow
sorry, Cabinet Secretary, I think we have to try and draw some sort of line under this. What we will do, if it will be satisfactory to the committee, is to ask the NFUS what their position is, because I didn't hear them say that at committee, and I do have the actual recorded quote, which I think you have, Cabinet Secretary. So what we will do, so we'll no need to ask the Cabinet Secretary again, is to ask the NFUS to clarify exactly what their position is concerning payments. Is everybody happy with that? And we can maybe move on, yeah? Right, thank you. And that leaves Mr. David Duguid.
20. Okay, thank you. Cabinet Secretary, you've said that the bill fails to deliver on promises that Scottish farmers will continue to receive at least the same level of funding. What would you like to see this bill contain on agricultural funding for Scotland?
Well, it's a very fair question, Mr. Duguid, and I've suggested on numerous occasions to Mr. Gove directly in meetings that we've had that he should provide a reassurance on the parliamentary record of the funding that should be provided, the funding that was promised during the BrExit referendum. And I would repeat that the UK's bill does fail to deliver on the promises made in the referendum. It contains nothing to honour the promises made that all lost funding for farming would be at least replaced. And I have pressed Mr. Gove on this on numerous occasions. The importance of the red meat levy is also a cause for concern in this bill. And having been assured originally that it would be included in the bill at introduction, it has now been tabled as a backbench amendment with no warning given to the devolved administrations. And my information, although we've only just got this, is that it is in need of substantial improvement. And this is important because there has been a real unfairness with, I think, a couple of £1 million due really to market Scottish high-quality meat has instead been earmarked and not received from Scotland. This is a long-standing grievance which the UK government have not sorted out adequately, and I very much hope that it will now be so sorted out in the course of this bill. I'd also ask that the issue of ensuring that imported foodstuffs, particularly meat, should meet the high standards of welfare, hygiene, labelling and so on that are met in this country should be put in the face of this bill. Mr. Gove argued in that respect that this was the UK government policy, but it will be included in a trade bill. That's why I haven't majored on that. It's one of the reasons why I take the stance that we do, because he has provided an assurance that it would be dealt with in that way. And finally, the bill doesn't deal with geographical indicators, and this is worth hundreds of millions of pounds, particularly Scotch beef and Scotch lamb, but I think 12 or 13 other measures are absolutely vital. And we're concerned that the reason the UK is not willing to do as we wish, which is a reciprocal recognition of EU and UK indicators, is that they wish to keep this in reserve as a lever within which to use as a negotiating lever in other Brexit negotiations. That carries with it the risk that the EU would take legislative action on a tit-for-tat basis to refuse to recognise Scotch beef and Scotch lamb. That would be absolutely devastating given the importance of access to those EU markets. So that's just a quick summary.
I appreciate your comments on animal welfare, red meat levy, geographical indicators, and broadly agree with everything you said there, although that wasn't the question. If I could just rephrase the question slightly, it might be easier to answer, more or less yes or no. Is legislation needed, given that the UK government has said that it is committed to the same cash total in funds for Scotland until 2022?
Well, that assurance doesn't match the promises made before Brexit. The funding would continue. And indeed we know that direct support payments are, according to the Treasury, are to be ceased in 27/28. And indeed, I'm informed reliably that a DEFRA paper back in 2005 set out the desire to cease this direct payments. So this really has been something that has been kind of cooked up in Whitehall for many, many years. And I'm astounded that there's not a huge concern amongst all members representing Scottish constituents that this direct support, which is crucial, I'm told it's crucial by my constituents and farmers and crofters throughout the country and crofters and Casey Highlands. This direct payment, direct support is absolutely crucial for what they do and to sustain their work in rural communities, as I'm sure Mr Duguid knows. So I don't understand why the Conservatives want to end direct payments. And I would have thought this bill would be a good opportunity to insert in tablets of stone that should not happen.
Just on the back of that question and answer, so you're not satisfied with the commitment of cash total in funds for Scotland until 2022. Can you tell us what commitment has the EU given to its member state farmers beyond 2022 for cash funds?
Well, the 7-year programmes I referred to will come to an end in 2020, and the new programme will begin in 2020 to 2027. And therefore, it's up to the EU to determine its policies, as has always been the case. The point I'm making is that the EU payments over the period of the UK's membership of the EU have come to be taken as read and for granted by farmers and crofters. There are many aspects of the CAP which we feel are unfair. For example, the disproportionate penalties that I believe are unfairly imposed on farmers, but they have come to expect the support from the EU. And lastly, the guarantee that has been made in respect of some Pillar 2 payments is that they will only be continued in respect of farm support. Those that don't include farm support, the guarantee, Mr Duguid, terminates in 2020. So that's only about 18 months away. And therefore, that assurance, particularly with regard to non-farm support payments, is far, far less, surely, than what we were all promised on the back of the BrExit bus. But sadly, the back of the bus promises to Brexit haven't even translated themselves onto the side of a fact packet as far as the UK government's commitments are concerned.
Okay. So you have no understanding or no awareness of any commitment by the EU of maintaining funding for farmers of its member states beyond 2022?
Well, the EU are committed to continue a regime of support for CAP as they have in the past. None of us here predict exactly what that will be because that's for the EU to determine. And if the UK decide and the Brexit process goes ahead, then the UK won't play a part in that. The last point I make is this, and this is very serious indeed, that next year, 2019, the level of payment per hectare for farmers and crofters in Scotland, compared with all of the EU countries and the rest of the UK for that matter, will be the very lowest. Next year, Scottish farmers and crofters will receive the lowest level of support per hectare than any other part of the EU. I think that's shocking, and the convergence review was designed in order to address that, although of course it was promised to be initiated several years ago. But as a reasonable person, I will seek to continue to cooperate to seek to ensure that the UK government deliver. And I don't know why Mr Lamont finds this funny. It's £14,000 for every farm in Scotland. That's the amount that we've lost because the convergence policy was designed by the EU in order to bring the low level of payments that we enjoy in Scotland up to not even the average, but 90% of the average. I don't think there's anything funny about that. Maybe Mr Lamont disagrees.
Move on at that point and go over to Ged Killen.
Thank you, Chair. Cabinet Secretary, you'll be aware that we are soon beginning our inquiry into the relationship between the UK and Scottish Government. And every time I sit in a session like this, I think that inquiry can't happen soon enough. But you perhaps covered this already in your previous answers. Can you confirm what discussions you've had with the UK Government regarding the allocation of Scottish agricultural funding during a transition period and post-transition? Have any specific commitments been sought or given?
Yes, I have sought. First of all, I've had many discussions with Mr Gove and Mr Eustice, and I think the member is misinformed if he thinks that these discussions are characterised by anything other than an attempt to engage in a constructive fashion. And I think Mr Eustice and Mr Gove, I hope, would recognise that, as I do. But my job is to stand up for Scotland and get the best possible deal. And that's why the funding commitment that I've sought is to implement what we were promised when people were persuaded to vote for Brexit, namely that the level of funding in Scotland and rural Britain would be at least matched. In addition to that, I've obviously called upon the UK government to repatriate the money due to Scottish farmers and crofters, an average of £14,000. That is plainly a manifest unfairness. Now, we haven't got the commitments that I've asked for, and that was, I think, the question you asked. What we have got is a commitment that direct payments will continue up to 2022. I welcome that as far as it goes, but it doesn't go far enough, because farming is a long-term business. Land management is a long-term business. And as far as the Pillar 2 payments, at the risk convener of repeating myself, the commitments in respect of non-farm support payments expire in 2020. So, plainly, the commitments that have been made are inadequate. And again, that was a point that was very clearly made, I believe, by the NFU, with whom we also enjoy a very good relationship and regular discussions.
Can I just ask you, Cabinet Secretary, about this new review into intra-UK allocation of agricultural funding, which I believe the government has charged Lord Hughes to review, which will be a 6-month review, and I believe it's due to report by 2022. The only thing we know about this so far is that it won't be subject to the Barnett formula, which I've seen presented as good news in Parliament. It sort of strikes me as perhaps unambitious. What are your view about what should happen in the allocation of funding across the United Kingdom?
Well, first of all, we have more farmers and crofters per head in Scotland than elsewhere in the UK. And as a share of the total economy, the farming and crofting amounts, I think, to kind of about 16% of the UK. You can check the exact figure. But in other words, it's around about double the, broadly speaking, the Barnett formula contribution. So anyone that suggested that Barnett should apply would be proposing to cut in half support. That plainly is nonsense. The starting point, seems to me, is the existing level of finance. But the convergence review, as you have rightly said, was announced by the UK government, was agreed to by the UK government last November. And the agreement was reached between myself and Mr Gove. We exchanged terms of reference, and the fact that although the person conducting the review would be decided by picked by the UK government, and they picked Lord Hugh, and we're happy with that, that we would choose one person to represent the Scottish government. That was fine. In February, I had a telephone conversation with Mr Gove in which he said that he was broadly happy with the terms of reference. We then pressed and got no answer to get the inquiry going. We then discovered in August, September, that the Treasury had intervened and imposed various strictures de novo on the terms of the review. We can't share these because they're in confidence, but they appear to hamstring the review in the sense of what the Treasury would do after it's completed. Normally when you have a review, you let the review go ahead and then you wait to see what it comes up with by way of recommendations before you decide what to do. Nonetheless, because of the importance of this matter, we think that the review should go ahead. Sadly, Mr Gove announced that there would be the review prior to our resolving the various matters of agreement and differences of agreement. Not least, for example, convener, will the review have access to all the advice that was given to ministers? If it does not, how can it do its job? As matters stand, no answer, as far as I'm aware, has been given to that. Finally, the Treasury apparently suggested that we should nominate 2 people to represent Scotland, and the Prime Minister would select the person to represent Scotland. Well, these were, very clearly moving the goalposts after the game had begun. So you can understand that this has caused concern. But the bigger picture is that I'm keen that this review should get going. And incidentally, I don't recognise Maybe the UK government have told you something they haven't told me, but I don't recognise the 222 as the outcome of the inquiry. I think I'm correct in saying that it's envisaged that Lord Hugh, with a panel, which incidentally would comprise advisors from Scotland, representatives from Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and the UK, that the inquiry should be conducted much more speedily than that. And if you think about it, it needs to be in order to be able to inform the bigger question of the fair allocation of intra-UK funding. I'm happy if the convener wishes to provide a lot more detail and background insofar as I can, consistent with our duty of confidentiality, if that would help the inquiry that you're conducting.
I think that would be very helpful, and we look forward to securing that. I mean, obviously you can't go into detail about the conversations you've had because of the confidentiality, but is there anything that you could tell this committee in areas that should concern us or we should look at?
Well, I think the inquiry must be independent, and I think Lord Hugh is, I don't know him myself, but I believe that he's got an impeccable reputation for issues of governance and independence, so I think that's a good thing. I think it's essential that Scotland and Wales pick their own representatives. That was the agreement initially. I think it's quite wrong that that should be changed. Any inquiry convener of importance has to have access to the prime documents, otherwise it cannot do its job, it's gagged. So we're waiting for a response on that, and it would be very helpful if the committee could express the view that to get to the bottom of things, such access is necessary. I would imagine that such documents would be treated as confidential until such time as the report's recommendations are concluded, at which point they would obviously have to be made public. After all of these years, when this review was promised back, I think from Owen Patterson's day in 2013, 2014, we need to get this done. We need to get this over. And my hope is that it will inform a fair debate, an honest debate with the UK government and the devolved administrations, whereby a fair allocation of funding post-Brexit, if it happens, can be achieved for our farmers and crofters. And I think that must be the hope of the outcome of this review.
Lastly on this, and I note your frustration about the previous conversions uplift money being deprived from Scotland, and I get this all the time from my farmers. Real frustration and anger that this money has effectively not come back to Scotland where it should rightly belong. Is it gone? Is there no chance whatsoever that the UK government may still allow Scotland this money so that we can properly compensate our farmers?
Well, no one is suggesting that the particular allocations of funding made in the years 2014 to 2018 can be revisited. I mean, what's done is done. But it must be possible, convener, if the review says so, if the review recommends that there have been wrongs in the past, it must surely be possible for these wrongs to be righted, albeit without taking money from farmers elsewhere who received it in good faith. We have made it absolutely clear to our Welsh and Northern Irish counterparts, and indeed to our friends in England, that we are not suggesting that any money should be recouped from anybody. This is an issue, I think, convener, ultimately between the UK government and its Treasury and the Scottish government about a fair allocation of funding. Funding that I think no one really disputes was always intended for Scottish farmers and crofters and only for Scottish farmers and crofters. None other in the UK qualified. And this policy had a very clear aim. It was to level the playing field, to balance out the inequity of the low level of payments here with a higher level of payments elsewhere, to bring them up to the EU average. It was a fair policy, I think, a good EU policy, but it was thwarted, in my view, by the UK government. And therefore, the recommendations of this review should, on the basis of a public debate, be capable of righting the wrongs and bringing to an end an old sang, if you like.
Thank you for that. John Lamont.
Thank you, Chairman. Cabinet Secretary, you've said in relation to the WTO provisions within the bill that it will ride roughshod over the devolution settlement and impose policy constraints on Scotland. I just wondered if you could explain how or why you think these WTO provisions are actually infringing the devolution settlement.
Well, it's not actually my view, Mr. Lamont, it's the view of very senior legal advice that we've received in the Scottish Government. And let me explain exactly the basis of that legal advice. Clause 26 of the bill concerns the WTO agreement on agriculture, and we believe that our consent to the Scottish Parliament is required because it concerns the implementation of international obligations as regards matters, namely agricultural support, which are devolved. And Clause 26 contains provisions which would affect the executive competence of Scottish ministers as regards the exercise of functions in relation to agricultural support in Scotland. So, if you like, this was an argument that arose because of legal advice that we took. This was not an argument that I, as a minister, a politician, cooked up in my office. It is because we have had the clearest and most authoritative legal advice that we pursued this. Now, when I raised it with Mr. Gove, he undertook that there would be, and this is in the public realm, there would be discussions between senior law officers. Now, it's not for me to discuss what discussions have taken place between the senior law officers. There's protocols which mean that I am not permitted to do so. But let me just say that the real frustration here, Mr. Lamont, is that we have set out our stall, we have given our justification, we have set out our rationale. Namely, this is not the setting of WTO agreements, this is the implementation of agreements which are plainly devolved. And what we haven't had is any setting out of the stall, any rationale, any justification from the UK government. So maybe when Mr. Gove gives evidence pretty soon, you could ask him that very question.
So the under the terms of the bill, it is the Secretary of State who takes on responsibility for complying with WTO rules, and that has been described as the power grab. Where do those powers that the Secretary of State is going to assume under this bill currently rest?
Well, the WTO agreement doesn't apply at the moment because it would only apply post-Brexit. We accept that WTO international relations are a reserve function, but the implementation of these, we believe, and our legal advice is that they are devolved matters. And, Convener, if it would assist members, because these matters are partly legal, and we're not really here to have a legal debate, but I can help members of your committee, Convener, by pointing out that our arguments are in the public domain in our LCM, and if it would help the committee understand them better, they can have a good read of that.
Well, that's helpful. But we are complying with WTO rules just now through our membership of the European Union. It's the European Commission who has to comply with WTO rules. Is that not correct, Cabinet Secretary?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the question.
The WTO rules, we are complying to WTO rules just now through our membership of the European Union. So it's the European Commission that currently exercises those powers, which will then be assumed by the Secretary of State.
Yes, but the problem is that there is a refusal to recognise that the implementation of these powers impinges on devolved matters.
The agriculture is devolved, but these powers are currently exercised by the European Commission. So I just wondered what your concern is when you're happy for the European Commission to exercise those powers, but not the Secretary. But you have an issue with the Secretary of State, UK Secretary of State, who arguably has a better interest than the European Commission has for Scottish matters.
Well, I hope that's the case, although that's not really proven. It certainly hasn't been the case in convergence, has it?
So to answer my question, you are accepting that these powers are currently exercised by the European Commission, which you are content with, but the suggestion as laid out in this bill for the Secretary of State, you have an issue with?
No, that's not correct. Responsibility for compliance with the WTO is already devolved. What has been proposed in this bill is that that fact is not recognised and that the powers in respect of compliance, which already are devolved under the existing arrangements, would not remain devolved. And in the current arrangements, the European Commission is really just acting as a post box.
So the European Commission does have those powers, and those are going to be transferred to the Secretary of State. So the Secretary of State will be in the same role as the European Commission as of today. But I'm not aware of any campaign that you're running just now to take those powers off the European Commission and repatriate them back to Scotland.
The Commission doesn't have these powers. Member States.
Well, it's the Member States, I'm told, that are required to have the legal obligation to comply. So the European Commission doesn't actually have those powers. So I'm informed that although these are legal arguments, and although I think we're both lawyers, I'm not sure that either of us are particularly well qualified to opine on these matters.
With the greatest respect, Cabinet Secretary, you are making this a big political issue about power grabs.
Very senior lawyers. These are not political arguments.
Well, I'm
These
sorry.
are legal arguments.
Cabinet Secretary.
Cabinet Secretary. Very seriously by all members.
Cabinet Secretary, you, the Scottish Government, are making this a political point by talking about power grabs. But if these powers are currently exercised by the UK Government, which is now what you are suggesting, or indeed by the European Commission, there is no power grab.
No, that's not the case. We enjoy the powers at the moment. The UK Government, because of the way the legislation is framed, we see that have moved in our view. And it's the Member States who are the signatories of the WTO agreement, not the Commission. This is already a devolved area of policy. It would cease to be so if the predation, which we believe is the impact of the UK agricultural bill, were to proceed.
Okay, can we just... Can I just ask, Cabinet Secretary, have you seen the NFUS legal advice on this particular issue? And if you have, what does that say about the particular powers when it comes to this?
I'm not aware of having... Well, I haven't seen myself the NFU advice, and I don't believe that my colleagues in the Scottish Government have seen it. I mean, I would say that it's not the normal practice to share legal advice for the very nature of things, but I guess that the point I'd like to stress here, Convener, is, I'm not wanting a battle about these things. I'm wanting a peace treaty with these things, if that is how you want to term it.
Yep. I
would love for Mr. Gove to explain what his reasons are. We've explained our reasons and our argument. I think I've gone over it in principle. There's more detail on our LCM. If you have the chance to ask Mr. Gove, very courteous man, maybe he will explain to you what he has thus so far not explained to us, which is what is his argument in response to our pretty senior legal advice, very clear legal advice on these matters.
Can I suggest that you do have a look at the NFUS legal advice, because it does almost identically say what you have suggested and what you've presented as your legal advice, and we were just told that by the NFUS. But can I just ask about the practicalities?
Can I challenge that? The NFUS suggested it's the European Commission which currently exercises those powers.
Could I suggest again it has been circulated amongst the committee?
Well,
the NFUS
we heard it earlier.
So I just suggest you look at it. Could I just return to what these actually means, Cabinet Secretary? Because again, what we heard in the previous session is the NFUS is concerned that if this interpretation is taken forward, it would set limits on the amount of domestic support which could be targeted at specific measures that Scottish ministers may seek to apply in Scotland to meet their objectives. It would actually put a cap on what Scottish ministers could supply in order to assist and further assist Scottish farming. Is that your interpretation?
I'm sorry, for some reason the lights went on and off here, which distracted me from the premise, which I didn't quite catch. So perhaps rather than...
I'll try again. Did you hear me okay, yeah?
Yes, I can.
Good stuff. We're just saying in the last session, the NFUS told us that the practical outcome of this dispute over WTO powers would mean that the Secretary of State can limit the amount of support that could be offered by Scottish ministers to Scottish farming. Is that a representation that you recognise and would agree with?
Yes, I do, and yes, I am in agreement with that. And I think in particular, my understanding, and again I stress I'm not a legal expert, that's not my job, but my understanding is that the categories of support that are provided are categorised into kind of amber, green and red. And the Secretary of State, under the powers as currently drafted, would enable him in the UK to determine into which category certain types of support fell. If he decided that it fell into the wrong category, then, as you have been advised by stakeholders, that would have the potential effect of delimiting the powers that we currently enjoy. For example, payment of monies to hill farmers, something that we wish to continue to see happen.
Okay, thank you. John Roberts.
So, Cabinet Secretary, just on that point, in terms of the amber, the colour categorisation, who makes that decision today? Is that a job that you have today?
We decide these matters at the moment. What the changes in the UK agricultural bill would do, if you like, is that the UK government, over devolved policy in Scotland, would cut the cake and choose the slice.
Even though Scotland's not a member state of the WTO? it's Scotland that's doing that colour coding just now?
No, at the moment we set our policies and they have not been subject to any challenge. The risk is that the UK government, under the powers that he would have as the bill is currently drafted, would enable him to take decisions, as the stakeholders the convener has pointed out have argued, not only ourselves, that would allow the UK government to take decisions which would impact and potentially delimit what payments we can make. And I, for one, I don't know about you, Mr. Lamont, but I don't want that to happen. I want us to continue to be able to support our livestock farmers, our livestock farmers, in the way that we have enjoyed and taken for granted under the EU.
Right, we're just about concluded, Cabinet Secretary. You'll be relieved to know, but we have a question from Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much. Cabinet Secretary, DEFRA has said that existing Scottish Government policies, including voluntary coupled support, would still be possible under the Bill's provisions relating to WTO obligations. Do you agree with that assessment? And if so, why? Or if not, why not?
Well, of course, we can continue with voluntary coupled support for the time being, but as we've already covered, I think, in evidence, and as is really beyond doubt, the UK government have indicated that it's their plan, after a period of time, admittedly, but it's their plan to terminate certain elements of support, direct support, and we believe that that would be deleterious, and that's why, Ms. Jardine, our programmes, our plans, Stability and Simplicity, the only plan, incidentally, I mean, Health and Harmony may be a good name for a beautician's business, but it doesn't cut the mustard for the future of farming in Britain, so far as I can see. So we want to be able to continue to do it, not just for as long as the UK government says it's okay, but as long as it's necessary for the good of rural Scotland.
If I could just go back to that though, but I did say at the very beginning that DEFRA has said that existing Scottish Government policies, including voluntary coupled support, not only voluntary coupled support, but including voluntary coupled support, would still be possible under the Bill's provision. So what about other Scottish policies which DEFRA is saying could continue? Do you accept that assessment or do you disagree with it?
Well, it goes back to the nature of the specific assurances that are received, and no one is really more acquainted than myself with respect, because I've been to numerous meetings where they've been the topic of discussion, and the assurances are time limited. I mean, up to 222 for direct payments and 220 for non-farm support. And my argument, Ms. Jardine, is that as the NFU, I think, have argued, as I've said before in this session, the nature of the length of these assurances is insufficient for the needs of farming, and I strongly agree with that. I mean, after all, if you're running a business, and I think you were in that position as I was, you want to have certainty. If you don't know whether funding is going to continue beyond a relatively short period, you've got uncertainty. You're not going to plan for that new shed. You're not going to buy or enhance significantly your herd. You're not going to invest in a new combine harvester. You need that certainty, and that is what our Stability and Simplicity, the only plan, frankly, that I can see in the UK in relation to future farm support payments. That's what our plan offers, future for Scottish farmers and crofters, and that's probably why so many of them agree with our plan.
Can I ask you to clarify something? From what you said, the inference I'm taking from it is that your objection is to the time limit, because you've said several times that the problem is the 2022. So if it weren't for the time limit, would you be happy with it?
Well, no, because the UK government in their discussion paper, Health and Harmony, have talked about public goods, most of which are already being provided, as if they're going to be provided in the future. I think that's somewhat insulting to farmers who are already providing in Scotland access, they're providing environmental improvements. I think we should recognise the good work they do. But the main thing, I think, Ms. Jardine, is that the UK government doesn't seem to recognise the primary role of farmers as producers of high quality food. I saw some evidence, I think it was in your previous session, from a witness who suggested that the food was not of high quality or was poorly produced. I don't really accept that. I think we should value farmers for production of high quality food, and certainly that's what they do in Scotland. And I think they should continue to receive payment for that. So I don't just agree with Jardine about the time limits, although they're pretty scary. especially the 220 limitation. I do disagree with respect to Michael Gove in principle about the need for public support. We believe that both functions, food production and environmental stewardship, are worthy of continued support. The UK government has put a time limit on support for food production. I think that's deeply flawed.
Just lastly, Cabinet Secretary, just if you could update us if there's been any progress made between the Scottish Government and the UK Government in the 24 policy areas which potentially require legislative common frameworks, and of course, as you know, the majority of which relate to agriculture.
Well, we're working hard across the common frameworks, and you're right, 24 areas were identified as DEFRA as requiring a common framework, and some progress has been made. We've sought to engage constructively. But I think in order to have a common framework, we do need to have a basis of agreement. And I do, with respect, feel that the points that we've been dwelling on, substantial points we've been dwelling upon in this exchange between us, whatever our view, these are matters that I would like to resolve if we possibly can. But if not, we will stand our ground and we will continue to cooperate, as we do with the UK government and government agencies across the whole of the rural development issues. But without prejudice to that, because we're desirous of being cooperative, both myself and my officials here have been engaged very constructively in relation to the frameworks. And if the high-level matters are resolved, Convener, then I hope that we can continue to make further progress.
Well, thank you for that, Cabinet Secretary. It was a highly entertaining session, and other than the few seconds or so that we lost you when the lights went out, I think we managed to survive the technology and the gap between us, between the two parliaments. So thank you for your attendance today. Again, like anything further that you could usefully contribute to this committee. I think there was one item which our clerks will remind you about that you said you would submit, so we look forward to seeing that in due course. But thank you again today. Order, order.